section of chapter 2, and Rachel Reed is helping me read this last section of chapter 2. I'm very grateful to her to helping us with this project. So let's go ahead and head on into that. We're on page 63 if you're a person that's following along in any way, or you can simply listen. So remember last time we said we were going to turn to Matthew. And then, so I got to get back into this character. We'll turn next to Matthew, and I think we can cover things pretty quickly because Matthew is a whole lot like Mark, even more than Luke was. Matthew also portrays Jesus' suffering and humanity, for instance, reporting the same cry of dereliction from the cross.
So what's the major difference?
The biggest difference is that Matthew is tremendously concerned with demonstrating that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah.
Why?
By the time the evangelists, that's what the writers of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are sometimes called, are writing their Gospels, most of the early Christian communities are made up of both Jews and Gentiles, non-Jewish people. But it seems that Matthew's community probably has more Jewish people in it. So he's really interested in showing how Jesus fulfills Jewish prophecies about the Messiah.
We need to slow down a bit. How can Matthew's community be both Christian and Jewish?
That's a great question. It's easy for us to forget that in the early decades of Christianity, a person's identity as Christian, as opposed to Jewish, wasn't nearly as distinct as ours is today. Jesus is Jewish, and all of his disciples are as well, as were the first folks who believed in Jesus because of the witness of the disciples.
Okay, I think I'm following.
That changes when the Apostle Paul comes on the scene and takes the gospel to Gentiles. And it's not very long before there are all kinds of Christians, Jews, Greeks, Romans, and so forth. But early on, folks probably didn't think of themselves so much as Christian, something that is different from Jewish, but instead as Jews who believed that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah.
And Matthew's community is one of these groups?
Most likely. Again, we don't know for sure. But from the number of times Matthew quotes Jewish scripture, what Christians call the Old Testament, it sure sounds like Matthew is talking with people who know the Jewish traditions.
And so he wants to assure them that Jesus really is the Jewish Messiah?
Right. And he does this especially in two ways. One, he regularly interprets Jesus' ministry in terms of the life of Moses. So when Jesus preaches his most famous sermon, he preaches from a mountain.
That's the Sermon on the Mount?
Right? Luke, on the other hand, describes Jesus as preaching that sermon on the open plain. But Matthew describes Jesus on a mountain because that reminds you of Moses. Similarly, Matthew breaks up Jesus' teaching into 5 parts, which would remind people of the 5 books of the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, which tradition said were written by Moses.
Okay, that makes sense.
The second thing Matthew does is to point out how what happens to Jesus falls in line with the Jewish prophecies about the Messiah. And that shows up especially in his story of the events leading up to the cross. For instance, let's look at the scene in Gethsemane when Jesus is betrayed. This is from Matthew chapter 26. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." And then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. And suddenly one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels. But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say it must happen in this way?" At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I sat in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But all this has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets may be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled.
I think I see what you mean. Twice Jesus goes out of his way to say that what's happening is to fulfill the scriptures.
Right, and beyond that, there are all kinds of other references to the Old Testament. From Pilate's washing his hands of Jesus' death, a reference to a passage in Deuteronomy, to several references to the Psalms. All of this to make the case for a Jewish audience that Jesus really does fulfill the prophecies about the Jewish Messiah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is, although there's a dark side to this as well.
What do you mean?
It's very likely that when Matthew is writing, there is some controversy among the Jewish community about Jesus, whether or not he really was the Messiah, and that people are beginning to take sides. So Matthew doesn't just present his evidence and hope people believe in Jesus. He goes out of his way to paint his rivals in a bad light.
I'm not sure I'm following.
The major religious figures of Judaism after the fall of the Jerusalem temple are the Pharisees, the leaders of the local synagogues. They don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and so the people in Matthew's community have at least two options: side with Matthew in believing Jesus is the Messiah, or side with the Pharisees. So it often feels like Matthew's gospel is in part a running argument with the Pharisees about who's interpreting the Jewish scriptures and traditions correctly.
Can you give an example?
Sure, not only does Matthew make the reference to the Old Testament that we were talking about, but he also goes out of his way to show that Jesus' death was the fault of the Jewish religious authorities. Let's look at this troubling scene with Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. And the governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" And all of them said, "Let him be crucified." And then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified.
Oh my goodness. I see what you mean. It's like Matthew wants to make sure we realize this isn't Pilate's fault, but instead that the Jewish religious leaders are totally to blame.
Exactly. In the beginning of Matthew's gospel, when Herod and the chief priests want to kill Jesus, the Magi, or wise men, who aren't Jewish, are warned in a dream not to tell Herod where the baby Jesus is. Now another Gentile, Pilate's wife, has a dream warning her not to cooperate with the chief priests and Jewish elders.
Right. And then Pilate says he wants nothing to do with punishing Jesus. Is this only in Matthew, or do Mark and Luke describe it this way too?
Mark and Luke both tell about the request to free Barabbas, but no one else says that Pilate washed his hands of Jesus' death, or worse, that the crowds cried that they accept full responsibility for everything.
Yeah, I was really struck by the cry of the crowds. His blood be on us and our children. It just sounds so harsh.
It is. And while we can maybe understand how Matthew wrote something like that when his community was in the minority and having a bitter rivalry with their Jewish neighbors, through the centuries it's done tremendous damage. In some time periods, Christians used this blood oath as an excuse to beat up Jewish people during Holy Week. Holy Week.
So, how do we deal with this element of Matthew's gospel today?
Well, when you read Matthew and John too, as we'll see, you need to sometimes explain to others the original setting of the Gospels and how the community Matthew addressed was likely in the minority and feeling pressured. But eventually, Christians became the majority and held the power in Western society. That's been true for much of the last 1,500 years. We have to be cautious not to let Matthew's accusing tone guide our words and action. During Hitler's reign, for instance, Christians would use this passage to justify imprisoning and killing Jews.
That's awful.
Yes, it is. Scripture is powerful, and Christians have used it for good and evil over the centuries. That's why it's important for today's Christian to read Matthew alongside the other Gospels.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Mark and Luke, for instance, not only do not let Pilate off the hook, but they also show that there were clear political dimensions to Jesus' ministry. So it's not surprising that it's the Romans who actually crucified Jesus as a political prisoner. I think recognizing these two things will go a long way to helping us read the Gospels better.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. I can see how it's important that today's Christians not only point out why Matthew is writing the way he did, but also point to the larger picture of Jesus in order to stand against prejudice.
That's exactly right.
And what about Matthew's story of the resurrection?
That won't take long because Matthew again follows Mark's outline. But Matthew's story is far more dramatic, with an earthquake and flashing angel, a cover-up story involving the chief priests, part of the ongoing rivalry we talked about, and an appearance from Jesus where he commissions the disciples to take the Gospels into all the world.
Got it. Let's see if I can summarize. We've got Mark and Matthew, pretty similar in terms of wanting us to realize how human Jesus was and how very real his struggle was. Though Mark leaves things open ended, and Matthew ties things up so that we'll know the God who acted in the Old Testament is again at work, and this time through Jesus. And then there's Luke, who's more interested in how Jesus demonstrates God's love, compassion, and healing. Is that right?
Again, I'd say that's a very good summary.
Thanks. So I guess we're on to John next. And you said this one was pretty different.
Very different. Let's go back to Gethsemane, except that John doesn't call it Gethsemane or the Mount of Olives, but instead describes it as a garden.
I thought it was always called the Garden of Gethsemane.
We do usually call it that, but we get Gethsemane from Mark and Matthew. Only John calls it a garden.
How come?
Well, let's follow along and see. I'm reading now from John 18. After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. And then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. And when Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. And Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?"
I see what you mean. This almost seems like a totally different story. Well, maybe not totally different. The basic outline is the same, but it has a completely different feel.
Say a little more.
Well, for one thing, there's no prayer that this won't happen. No, it's impossible. Remove the cup. In fact, near the end, he says almost the exact opposite. After Peter takes out his sword, Jesus says, "Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?" It's like he wants everything to happen, or at least he is totally ready for it.
I think you're right. Jesus, according to John, is completely prepared for what is about to happen. In fact, he came into the world for this one purpose. Earlier, he says that he is the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. And then he goes on to say, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again."
So in this story, Jesus is pretty much in complete control.
Yes, that's in part why Jesus goes to this garden. He knows that Judas knows where it is.
Yeah, you had mentioned that John is the only one who calls it a garden. What's up with that?
John, like Matthew, has a strong sense of how Jesus' life and death fulfilled Jewish prophecy. And John, again like Matthew, not only shows this by citing particular passages, but also by making theological references. In the beginning of John's gospel, for instance, he starts out by saying, "In the beginning was the Word." And almost anyone familiar with Jewish scriptures would hear in John's "in the beginning" echoes of the whole biblical story starting in Genesis, in the beginning when God created. So here, when someone hears garden, they might very well go back to the story of the Garden of Eden, where God creates humans and where humans fall into temptation.
But in this garden, Jesus isn't tempted. In fact, it's the exact opposite. He's completely faithful.
Right, and so in a sense, Jesus succeeds where Adam and Eve failed. Not only that, but he also demonstrates the power he has and chooses not to use.
How so?
Did you notice that when Jesus asks who they're looking for and answers that it is he, Jesus of Nazareth, John writes that the soldiers Judas brought stepped back and fell to the ground.
Yeah, I wondered about that.
Well, a couple of details help to get at the more dramatic nature of John's portrayal. First, what Jesus says isn't really "I am he," but just "I am," which is the name God revealed to Moses at the burning bush. We fill in the implied he to make it sound better, but it really is Jesus claiming the divine name, "I am."
And that's why they fall to the ground?
Right, all 600 of them.
What?
Well, it reads that Judas brought a detachment or cohort of Roman soldiers, and that's about 600 men.
Why in the world would Judas need so many men?
He doesn't. But this is part of John's point. Jesus is that powerful. Judas brings 600 men, and yet they are all thrown off their feet when Jesus claims his divine identity. So there's no question about who's in control here, or that Jesus goes to the cross of his own accord.
And John's whole story about the cross is like this? Jesus being totally in command of things?
Pretty much, it comes through in a lot of little details. For instance, Mark, Luke, and Matthew all tell that a man, Simon of Cyrene, was pulled from the crowd to help Jesus carry his cross, which makes sense, since Jesus had already been whipped and beaten and must have been exhausted. But John goes out of his way to say that Jesus carried his cross by himself. And then at the cross, Jesus says a couple of things that are different from the other accounts.
That's right. Mark and Matthew have Jesus saying the same single thing, his cry of abandonment. And Luke reports Jesus is saying three things, each of which show him to be compassionate, forgiving, and trusting to the end. So what about John?
In John, Jesus says three things also. And we can look at them together. As usual, pay attention to what you notice. Here we go from chapter 19. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, "In order to fulfill the scripture, I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." And then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.
Okay, so the first thing that sticks out is that not all the disciples run away.
That's right. 3 women remain, as well as a disciple that goes unnamed in John's gospel, but is regularly referred to as the disciple Jesus loved.
And he tells them to take care of each other?
Yes, although it might be a little more than that, he actually tells them to become son and mother to each other. So in a sense, Jesus is creating a new family, a Christian family in which people are related to each other not because of your blood ties, but because they are disciples.
And he does all this while hanging from the cross?
Keep in mind that this is part of John's theology. The cross isn't a defeat for Jesus. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the place where God's glory is most fully revealed. Throughout John's gospel, Jesus will refer to this hour and the time of his glory, and both of those are now at the cross. What else struck you?
Well, he says that he's thirsty, which might make you think that, as with Mark and Matthew, John is showing Jesus' human side, that he has needs like the rest of us. But it almost sounds like he does this to fulfill scripture, not because he's really all that thirsty.
I think you're right. Further, the hyssop branch that they put the sponge on would frankly never have held a sponge.
What do you mean?
Hyssop is more of a plant than a tree, actually. It's something of a herb that has some medicinal value. It's primarily known from the Exodus story where the Israelites are commanded to dip it in the blood that is in the basin and touch the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood in the basin. This becomes part of the Passover story. So at the cross, it would kind of be like trying to put a sponge of wine onto the end of a palm branch.
So why does John describe it this way?
One of the big points that John wants to make is that Jesus is the new Passover lamb. John the Baptist describes him that way in the beginning of John's gospel. There's all kinds of symbolism to that effect as in this scene, and Jesus' death actually occurs at the same time the Passover lambs would have been slaughtered.
And that's different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
It is. In all 4 accounts, Jesus dies on a Friday. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that day is Passover. Passover, though, like Christmas, can fall on any day of the week. It happens to be on a Friday in these 3 Gospels. In John, though, Passover falls on a Saturday. And the Friday on which Jesus dies is the day before, called the Day of Preparation, when everything was prepared for the Passover celebration, including slaughtering the Passover lambs.
That's fascinating. John wants to make a point about who Jesus is, but what he's not so concerned about whether he is historically accurate.
That's well put.
So the third and final thing Jesus says is, "It is finished." After everything else in John's gospel, I have a hard time believing he was saying, "I'm so glad that's over."
No, you're absolutely right. Here, finished has more of the sense of an accomplishment, like the feeling of achieving what he set out to do.
Like mission accomplished?
Exactly.
So all of this is really interesting, but it also makes me wonder why John offers such a different picture of Jesus than the others.
And again, I think the answer is partly dependent on who we think are John's readers. Some experts believe he is addressing a community of Jewish Christians who, until relatively recently, had been worshiping in the local synagogue. But they may have found themselves at odds with their fellow Jews or may have been expelled from the synagogue because they believed that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. In a way, John's community is similar to those of Mark and Matthew. Like Mark's, John's community has been going through some stressful times, perhaps not persecution, but experiencing a sense of being cut off from its spiritual community. And like Matthew, John is trying to reassure his community that Jesus really is the Jewish Messiah and that the community is being faithful to its Jewish heritage in claiming Jesus as the Messiah.
I can see John's similarity to Matthew in terms of showing how what happens to Jesus fulfills scripture, but the tie to Mark is harder to see. Mark's Jesus is so incredibly human, and like we said, he seems to be confessing that God shows up in weakness rather than strength. John, though, seems to be saying the opposite.
You're absolutely right. What I meant is that Mark and John offer two contrasting answers to a similar question. If Mark's community is suffering, he's saying that God meets them in their suffering. John, however, is encouraging his community to persevere amid suffering, trusting that because God is strong enough to raise Jesus from the dead, God will also bring them through their difficulties as well.
And I can see how, depending on your circumstances, each of these answers could be helpful. I mean, there might be times when knowing God sympathizes with you is incredibly valuable, and others when it's important to have a sense that God can pull you through out of your difficulty.
I think you're right.
So, what about John's story of the resurrection? Does that have a similar emphasis on Jesus' power and strength?
John, perhaps not surprisingly, also has a different account of the resurrection than the other three Gospels, though it still follows the basic outline. While it's definitely worth reading on its own, I don't think we need to go into much detail here.
So that's it then. 4 accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection, all offering different details and perspectives.
And all contributing to how Christians over the centuries have tried to make sense of the cross.
That's what I was going to ask, actually.
What?
Well, given these different portraits, how have Christians made sense of them all? I appreciate that they decided 4 distinct portraits would be better than one seamless one, but how did they end up working with these 4 to say something really clear about the cross?
That's a great question. And while there may have been many different interpretations of the cross, which maybe isn't surprising given the different gospel pictures we've been talking about, we can group most of them into 3 schools of thought. Each looks at the cross in a distinct way.
3, not 4, to match the 4 gospels?
No, although I can see why you guessed that. Each gospel gives us a distinct description of the passion narrative and its meaning. Later, theologians read the gospels together and try to offer interpretations that are based on the combined stories and meanings of all 4, not just of one gospel at a time. They might, as we will discover, emphasize one part of the gospel stories or focus on one theme more than others, but they're essentially trying to deal with all of them. So we've ended up with 3 schools, or 3 theories of atonement that I mentioned.
I think that's probably the place to turn next.
Well, then let's do it. And that's the end of that second chapter, a very meaty chapter. So if you feel like you missed anything along the way, go back and re-listen. These are posted for you to go to whenever you need to. And you can always, I do this a lot. I pause, come back, pause, come back. So we will see you at Bible study, hopefully. And if you don't make it, just continue to enjoy learning from the book Time.